Hello there. In our previous lesson, we were looking at requirements of life, and we were able to mention some of those requirements. That it's important that multicellular organisms are supplied with the nutrients, oxygen, water, and because they produce waste during their metabolic processes, those waste must be removed from their bodies. Today, we want to move on to more requirements of life. Another requirement of life is body systems. Body systems are important because for those organisms that are made of many cells, the body systems is important for coordination of various activities in our bodies. Some of the systems, we shall mention them, but before we reach there, we want to find out the meaning of body systems. For instance, like circulatory system or digestive system, it is made up of several organisms that are coordinated so that they can function together. So the question that we shall start with, what is a body system? What is a body system? A body system is a group of organs that are synchronized to work together. I've just mentioned, for example, digestive system is made up of the mouth, is made up of esophagus, the stomach, small intestines, large intestines, and so forth. So they have to be synchronized so that they can work together. So we are going to look at examples of body systems that we shall deal with. Examples. So one of them is respiratory system. We have two, digestive system. We have three, circulatory system. We have four, excretory system. And others, the nervous system. It works together with endocrine system. So we shall go to the first example of respiratory system. So one of the organs that we shall look at, it has mouth, we have the nasal cavity, we have the pharynx, we have the larynx, larynx, and then in the larynx we have those membranous structure called the vocal cords, and then down the main respiratory system we have the trachea. The trachea goes down and then branches into two tubes called the bronchus. bronchus. If it is one, if there are two, the plural form is bronchi. The bronchus branches into small, fine tubes called the bronchioles. And then bronchioles further terminates into air sacs called the alveoli. Alveoli, if there are many, but singular form will be alveolus. And then we have the lungs. And all of this is housed in what we call a chest cavity. Down here, we have a muscular of sheet called the diaphragm. But all this from the larynx, trachea, bronchus, and the rest are housed in a structure called thoracic cavity. A structure called thoracic cavity or chest cavity. So once we have this, we are going to go through each one of them to find out their roles or to describe their roles. So because we have this diagram in your books, I'll remove and then we go through each part. So the first parts of respiratory system we have the nasal cavity. Nasal cavity. For us to get acquainted with the nasal cavity, from the nose, what we can see when you look at human being or the face, that space is what we call the nasal cavity. In the nasal cavity, if you looked at any human being, especially aged people, you realize that it has some hairs in the nasal cavity, small, fine hair-like structures. The role of hairs is to trap dust particles. Traps dust particles. That is why if you have been working in a dust environment and you have not used masks, and then you remove mucus from your nasal cavity, you realize that that mucus has some stains of dust because we have hairs that traps the dust particles. And also in the nasal cavity we have cells that usually secretes mucus. Mucus is important because it's also involved in trapping of dust particles together with pathogens. So nasal cavity, apart from these two major roles or two major structures, the hairs and mucus, it also allows movement of air from the atmosphere into the pharynx, which later will go into the lungs. Movement of air from the atmosphere through the pharynx into the lungs. Another structure is the mouth. Mouth is also important. Suppose you have a problem like flu, common flu or cold, sometime your nasal cavity will be blocked. When it is blocked, some of the breathing that will take place, it's through the mouth. So this one again allows movement of air. Movement of air from the atmosphere into the pharynx and then down into the lungs. You also have other structures, we have mentioned them, the pharynx. Another name of pharynx is throat. Throat, that's a common name, throat. So the role of pharynx simply allows movement of air from, we are starting from the upper part, as from our drawing, from the nasal cavity and the mouth into the larynx. Allows movement of air from mouth and nasal cavity into the larynx. Into the larynx. Another part is the larynx itself. Larynx is also called the voice box. For it to produce sound, the sound that I'm producing is due to some mechanisms in the larynx or the voice box. It performs two roles, as a digestive organ and also as a respiratory organ. But if it is for respiratory organ, mainly allows movement of air now from the pharynx. It allows movement of air from the pharynx into, to use an arrow, into the trachea. That's not the only role, because larynx has what you call the vocal cords. So this is the larynx. We are saying it's going to allow movement of air from the pharynx into the trachea. But that's not the only role. Remember, we have also said that larynx hosts what you call the vocal cords. So when air passes, when air from the mouth or from the nose passes over these membranous structures, folds of membranous tissue, they are going to vibrate. The edge of these vocal cords are going to vibrate, and in the process it produces sound. So production of sound. Production of sound. Another part is the vocal cords. So what are these vocal cords? These are folds of membranous tissue folds of membranous tissue that produces sound when airstream passes over it. When a stream of air passes over it. So how is it going to produce sound? When it vibrates, the edge are going to vibrate, and in the process it produces sound. Then the major parts, we also have the trachea. It is very clear in your book and on the diagram. So the trachea runs from the larynx into bronchus, or into the lungs. But it has some structures. One of the most important structure in the trachea is cilia, hair-like structures. Hair-like structures. Hair-like structures, and the role of this, again, just like in the nose or in nasal cavity, traps dust particles. Again, in the trachea, we have cells that secrete mucus. We have already identified the role of mucus in the respiratory system, performing nearly the same role, trapping of dust particles. But remember, these dust particles are together with disease-causing organisms. We call them pathogens. So the role of trachea mainly, apart from protecting respiratory system from invasion by microorganisms and entry of dust particles, it also allows passage of air from the pharynx. Passage of air from pharynx to the lungs. To the lungs. That's why sometimes if you have a problem and then you cough out, if you have been working in a dust area, or if we have microorganisms, they are going to come out together with mucus, as we have identified. It is the one that traps dust particles together with pathogens. Another part is the bronchus. In plural, bronchus is, we say bronchi. So what is bronchus? Bronchus is made up of two tubes that branches from the trachea and terminates into bronchioles and terminates into bronchioles. What is the role? The role of bronchus simply allows movement of air from the trachea into the bronchus. Allows movement of air from trachea into the bronchioles. Another part is the bronchioles. These are finely divided, branched end of the bronchus. But again, they terminate into a structure called alveoli or alveolus. If it is one, if there are many, we call them alveoli. And we have been looking at also the roles. Role simply allows movement of air from the bronchi or bronchus into the alveoli. Air movement from bronchus into alveoli. The other part is the alveoli or alveolus. If I may use a diagram, alveolus will appear like this in a magnified image. So this is the bronchioles, and then now this is the air sac, alveoli. There are actually very many in the lungs, and because of that, they make the lungs appear spongy. So the major structure about alveoli is that they are highly supplied with blood capillaries. Highly supplied with blood capillaries. So why is it that it should have very many blood capillaries? remember this is the main site for gaseous exchange. So because of that, it will have high supply of blood capillaries to maintain a steady diffusion gradient. Diffusion gradient. So these are very important, part of the alveoli. Another very important structure in the alveoli is that it has a film of moisture. A film of moisture. Film of moisture will appear if we have this magnified part, and then we go inside the alveoli, we shall have a film of moisture. So this one has a film of moisture. What is the role of film of moisture? When air comes into the alveoli, air is in gaseous form, that one you know. For it to reach other parts of the body, it has to dissolve in this moisture. It has to dissolve in the moisture. So the role of film of moisture dissolves gases before diffusion, before they can diffuse into the body cells. And then we have already said that alveoli are very many. Why are they numerous? They are numerous. Why are they numerous? To increase surface area. They are numerous to increase surface area for gaseous exchange. For gaseous exchange. So as we look at these structures of the alveoli, then it gives us the major role of alveoli. Alveoli, therefore, is the major site for gaseous exchange in the lungs or in the respiratory system. But for all this to happen, we have mentioned the lungs, the trachea. Where are they found? In our bodies, they are found in the chest cavity. Therefore, chest cavity also is part of the respiratory system, also called thoracic cavity. Chest cavity is also called the thoracic cavity. So what forms the chest cavity? If, for example, you are in a position, you can feel your body just around the chest, we have ribs. So chest cavity is made up of ribs. But these ribs are held in position by other structures. We have in front a bone where all the ribs join. We call that bone as the sternum. And then at the back, also ribs are held together by a bone or a series of bone called the vertebral column. So you realize that this is, if that is the back, that is the front part, we are going to have ribs running from one end to another. From one end of this bone, if this is the front side, we shall call this one sternum. At the back, we have a vertebral column. But below the chest cavity, we have a tissue or a muscle, a sheet of muscle called diaphragm. So these are the structures that makes the chest cavity. So what is the role of chest cavity? Chest cavity usually changes in volume. Changes in volume to allow inhalation and exhalation. We can demonstrate this together. If you are somewhere, you can stand in that room and then just hold your ribs. Inhalation is breathing in. When you breathe in, your hands will not remain in the same position. When you breathe in, your hands will move outwards and upwards. Exhalation, inhalation, that is. For exhalation, when the chest cavity or when the muscles relax, the hands goes back to their position. So we have changes in volume of the chest cavity to allow inhalation and exhalation. Also, it has some muscles covering the ribs. Muscles. We have muscles that cover the ribs. They're not just bare. Those muscles are called intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles. So it is the intercostal muscles that will contract and relax to bring about the changes in volume of the chest cavity so as it can ventilate the lungs through inhalation and exhalation. And then the last part that we can look at is the diaphragm. What is this? Diaphragm. Diaphragm. We have said diaphragm is part of the chest cavity. But where is it found? Diaphragm, if we have the lungs, a small sketch here, if these are lungs, diaphragm is found at the lower part of the lungs. So this is a sheet of muscles, a sheet of muscles across the lower part of chest cavity. Across the lower part of chest cavity. In a normal situation, in a relaxed mood, the diaphragm is in a dome shape or assumes dome shape. Dome. Dome means curving upwards like that. But when you want to inhale, what will happen? This muscle will contract. When it contracts, it goes flat. When it goes flat, the volume of the chest cavity will increase, reducing pressure in the chest cavity, while the air pressure, which is higher, will push the air through the nose. We can look at the importance of respiratory system. Importance of respiratory system. One importance. Respiratory system provides a surface for gaseous exchange. Now the question is, we have already looked at the structures that makes a respiratory system. Where do you think this surface is provided for? You can think through your photo in the book and tell me. Provides a surface for gaseous exchange. What is that very major structure? I think you have gone through and you can realize that we have mentioned that it is the alveoli. It is the alveoli or alveolus, if it is one, that forms the major site for gaseous exchange. How is it providing a surface for gaseous exchange? Because we have said they are usually very many, numerous. They are numerous. When there are many, they increase the surface area for gaseous exchange. And apart from being many, we have said it also has high supply of blood capillaries. Capillaries are important because they will take away any oxygen that diffuses and bring in carbon dioxide to be eliminated. Another role of respiratory system provides protection of respiratory surface against dehydration and temperature changes. So how is this provided? It is provided because we have a lot of blood supplied, and remember the role of blood. You are able to be told in year 8, the role of blood, one of them is distribution of heat. And we have said it is supplied with numerous blood capillaries. So because of that, we have less temperature changes in the chest cavity. Again, the lungs and the alveoli are housed in the chest cavity to prevent temperature changes. At the same time, dehydration. Another role is defense, provides defense against invasion of the system by microorganisms and pathogens. Again, I want you to go through the system and find out the structures in the respiratory system that can aid in defense. If you look at the diagram, we're able to mention several: trachea, the nasal cavity. We started with the nasal cavity. We said in the nasal cavity we have hairs, and the role of hairs in the nasal cavity is to trap dust particles. But remember, the dust particles are together with pathogens. In the trachea, we mentioned cilia. Cilia is still hair-like structure. Again, they trap pathogens. So that when you cough out, cilia will propel the pathogens together with mucus and partly with pathogens. And then we talked of mucus. Mucus in the nasal cavity, in the trachea, again for the same purpose, trapping dust particles together with pathogens. So that is how this importance is achieved. Another role, we looked at the voice box. So when I mention voice box, and then you can easily link to function, production of sound. I want you to mention a structure in the respiratory system that is involved in production of sound. You look at the diagram, we are able to label a place or a part called the vocal cords. Vocal cords, we said, are folds of membranous tissue which vibrates. The edges of the vocal cords vibrates, and in the process produces sound. So these are the major functions of a respiratory system. So as we conclude this part or this system, I want you to go through the following questions. One of the questions states the roles of the following parts. Of a respiratory system. We have trachea, the alveoli, diaphragm, the bronchus, and then E, the larynx. So we can go through together the question, state the roles of the following parts of a respiratory system, trachea. We have said the role of trachea is to allow movement of air. Movement of air from the larynx to the bronchus, of course, which leads to the lungs. Alveolus. The role of alveolus. Role of alveolus, we have said, is the major site for gaseous exchange. If we can highlight a little bit, it forms the major site for gas exchange because it has numerous blood capillaries, and again it is there are many in number, so because of that it increases surface area for gaseous exchange. Diaphragm. In a review, we said diaphragm is a sheet of muscle that's found just below the chest cavity. And the role of diaphragm simply contracts and relaxes, changing the volume of the chest cavity. Contracts and relaxes to change volume of chest cavity. We have found out that the very important reason for the volume of the chest cavity to change is to bring about changes in pressure in the chest cavity. You have done a demonstration that if you hold on the ribs and then you want to breathe in, there will be some changes in the chest cavity. We have seen moving upward and outward, and then the opposite happens. So the same thing happens with the diaphragm. As the chest cavity is moving upward, and outward, the volume is increasing, but the diaphragm is flattening. When it flattens, the volume has increased. When the volume increases, pressure inside the chest cavity reduces. When pressure inside the chest cavity reduces, it forces air from the atmosphere through the nostril into the lungs. The bronchus. We said bronchus are two branches or branched tubes from the trachea, and their main role is to allow movement of air from trachea, from trachea to the bronchioles. Larynx. We gave another name for larynx. You can remember? Yes, you can remember that we said the other name of larynx is the voice box. But we were able to give the role. We said the major role of larynx is to allow air to move from pharynx to the trachea. Although we gave another role, we said that in the larynx it has vocal cords. Those vocal cords, in a stream of air, they vibrate, the edges vibrate, producing sounds, production of sounds, production of sounds. The last question, which will be your homework, is this. Question 2. State ways in which alveoli are adapted to their function. So the question requires you to find out what are the structures in the alveoli that makes it to perform the major role of acting as a site for gaseous exchange. So we mention the structure and then give the modification and the function of that structure in the alveoli. I think we have come to the end of this subtopic, respiratory system. We are going to look at another system in our next lesson. I hope you have enjoyed the lesson. Thank you.